The great hall of the Galactic Military Academy buzzed with the sound of thousands of voices speaking in dozens of languages. Commander Veltoth stood at the center of the massive amphitheater, his 4 crystalline arms folded behind his back as he watched the cadets settle into their seats. The walls stretched up into darkness above them, filled with young beings from every corner of the galaxy who had come here to learn the art of war. Veltoth's skin caught the light from the projection screens around him, casting rainbow patterns across his angular face. He had given this lecture on unconventional warfare tactics hundreds of times before, but today would be different. Today he would tell them about the humans. The noise slowly died down as more cadets noticed the towering figure waiting at the podium. Veltoth was known throughout the academy as one of the finest tactical minds in the Altarian Defense Corps, a veteran of 17 major campaigns who had never lost a battle. When he spoke, even the most arrogant young officers listened. Near the front rows, Cadet Taemin adjusted his silver scales nervously and leaned forward in his seat. The young Zephyrian had heard stories about Commander Veltoth's legendary victories against the hegemony forces in the Outer Rim. Beside him, Cadet Nari's 6 eyes blinked in sequence as she studied the commander with typical hegemony caution. Cadets, Veltoth's voice carried easily through the hall without need for amplification. Today we discuss the most dangerous enemy force I have ever encountered in 3 decades of military service. A ripple of interest passed through the crowd. Many of the students straightened in their seats, expecting to hear about the feared Dominion shock troops, or perhaps the mysterious shadow fleet that had terrorized shipping lanes for years. This enemy possesses no advanced technology, Veltoth continued, his mandibles clicking as he spoke. They are not particularly strong or fast. Their weapons are primitive by galactic standards. Their ships are slow and poorly armored. Confused murmurs began to spread through the amphitheater. Several cadets exchanged puzzled glances. What kind of enemy could inspire fear in someone like Commander Veltoth, while possessing none of the usual advantages? Yet in 3 years of conflict, this enemy cost the Coalition more ships, more soldiers, and more resources than any war in our recorded history. Veltoth paused, letting his words sink in. I am speaking, of course, about humanity. The reaction was immediate and exactly what Veltoth had expected. Laughter erupted from several sections of the hall. A group of Karathi cadets in the middle rows clicked their beaks in amusement. Even some of the more serious students smiled at what they assumed was an elaborate joke. Humans were barely more than a footnote in galactic politics. Their small empire consisted of perhaps 50 worlds scattered along the rim of settled space. Most species considered them recent primitives who had only discovered faster-than-light travel within the last century. They were known mainly as traders and miners, not warriors. Cadet Taemin was one of those laughing loudest. Commander, he called out, his silver scales shimmering as he spoke. Surely you mean this as a teaching exercise? Humans are barely capable of interstellar flight, let alone military operations. Veltoth's crystalline features remained perfectly still as the laughter continued. He waited patiently for the noise to die down, his 4 arms still folded behind his back. When silence finally returned to the hall, his voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the vast space. You laugh now, he said, his tone carrying a weight that made several cadets shift uncomfortably in their seats. I have seen what they are capable of. What I am about to tell you may save your lives one day. The commander activated the holographic projectors around the podium. Images filled the air above the students' heads, showing star charts of the Kepler mining sectors, a region of space along the border between Coalition territory and the expanding human frontier. The border wars began 3 years ago over mining, rights in the Kepler sectors, Veltoth explained as the images shifted to show industrial facilities and asteroid mining operations. What should have been a simple negotiation became a shooting war when human colonists refused to evacuate systems they claimed as their own. Nari's multiple eyes focused intently on the display. As a hegemony citizen, she had studied the border, wars in her political science classes, but only as a minor territorial dispute that had been quickly resolved in the Coalition's favor. The Coalition assembled a force of 300,000 troops and 500 ships to remove the human presence from contested systems, Veltoth continued. Intelligence reports indicated we would face perhaps 30,000 human soldiers with minimal space support. More images appeared in the air, showing the massive coalition fleet assembling at staging areas. The ships were sleek and powerful, equipped with energy shields and plasma cannons that could reduce a small moon to dust. In comparison, the few human vessels captured in long-range scans looked crude and blocky. Our commanders estimated the operation would take 2 weeks, Veltoth said, his mandibles clicking with what might have been bitter amusement. They were wrong. The holographic display shifted to show footage from the first engagement, a skirmish over a mining station in the outer reaches of the Kepler sectors. Coalition forces had surrounded the station and demanded surrender. The response from the human commander had been brief and unprintable. "Watch carefully," Veltoth instructed as the footage began to play. The cadets saw coalition ships moving into attack formation around the mining station. The human defenders had perhaps a dozen small vessels, clearly outgunned and outnumbered. It should have been a massacre. Instead, the humans did something no military academy in the galaxy taught. They scattered their ships in apparently random directions, making no attempt to form defensive lines or protect their station. Most of the cadets assumed they were watching a rout. But the human ships were not running away. They were moving to positions where coalition vessels could not fire on them without risking hitting their own forces. In minutes, the carefully planned coalition attack formation had become a confused mess with ships afraid to shoot for fear of friendly fire. "This is elementary tactics," muttered one of the Karathi cadets. "Any first-year student knows not to position forces where crossfire is possible." Veltoth's 4 eyes fixed on the speaker. "Indeed, yet our commanders had never faced an enemy willing to use such tactics." The footage continued. While coalition forces tried to reorganize their formation, the human ships began targeting not the enemy vessels, but their communication arrays and sensor equipment. Within an hour, the superior coalition fleet found itself nearly blind and unable to coordinate their movements. "The humans fought for 18 hours, Veltoth explained, as the images showed the battle continuing through day and night cycles. "They never tried to destroy our ships completely. Instead, they targeted specific systems, engines, weapons, life support. By the end of the engagement, most of our vessels were intact, but completely helpless. Taemin's silver scales had lost some of their shimmer as he watched the display. But surely this was just luck. One unusual battle proves nothing." Veltoth's crystalline features seemed to catch more light as he turned toward the young Zephyrian. "I thought the same thing. Until the siege of Station Omega-7. The commander deactivated the holographic display and moved closer to the rows of cadets. His voice dropped lower, forcing them to lean forward to hear him clearly. "Station Omega-7 was considered impregnable," he said, each word carefully measured. 400 years of warfare, and it had never fallen. The coalition had it under siege for 6 months with 50,000 troops and no progress. Veltoth paused, his 4 arms spreading wide as he gestured to encompass the entire hall. Then the humans arrived with 800 soldiers. The silence in the amphitheater was complete now. Even the most skeptical cadets had stopped laughing. "What happened next will be the subject of our discussion for the remainder of this course," Veltoth said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been fear. "You will learn why the mere mention of human tactics now causes experienced commanders to request transfers to other sectors. You will understand why the coalition, despite winning most battles, ultimately negotiated a peace treaty that gave the humans everything they originally demanded." The commander returned to his position behind the podium, his crystalline skin reflecting the lights of the hall as he looked out over the hundreds of young faces staring back at him. "But first," he said, his mandibles clicking with grim humor, "you must understand what you are truly looking at when you see a human soldier." Veltoth activated a simple display showing a standard human in military uniform. The figure looked unremarkable. Bipedal, soft-skinned, with no visible natural weapons or armor. To most galactic species, humans appeared almost pitifully vulnerable. "What do you see?" Veltoth asked. Hands and appendages rose throughout the hall as cadets offered observations. "No natural armor. Weak physical structure. Limited sensory capabilities. Slow movement speed." Veltoth nodded as each weakness was identified. When the cadets finished listing the obvious disadvantages of human physiology, he let silence settle over the hall once more. "I see," he said, finally his voice carrying across the vast space like a judgment. Commander Veltoth watched the faces of his students as they tried to process his words. The young cadets still looked confused, unable to understand how creatures they saw as weak could be considered dangerous predators. He had expected this reaction. 3 years ago, he had thought exactly the same thing. Station Omega-7, Veltoth began, his 4 crystalline arms moving to activate a new holographic display, sits at the junction of 7 major hyperspace routes in the Kepler sectors. Control of that station means control of all trade and military movement through the region. The massive fortress appeared in the air above the cadets, rotating slowly to show its impressive defenses. Omega-7 was built into a large asteroid, its surface bristling with weapon platforms and shield generators. Docking bays capable of holding entire fleets were carved deep into the rock. For 6 months, coalition forces had maintained a siege. With 50,000 troops, Veltoth continued, as the display showed the surrounding space filled with military vessels. The station's commander, Admiral Thexvol, had 2,000 defenders and supplies for 3 years. Our attempts to take the station had cost us 12,000 casualties with no progress. Cadet Nari's 6 eyes studied the tactical display with growing understanding. The station's position made direct assault nearly impossible, and its shields were strong enough to withstand bombardment from even the largest coalition dreadnoughts. Then, long-range sensors detected a small human fleet approaching the system, Veltoth said, his mandibles clicking as new images appeared in the hologram. 15 vessels no larger than frigates, intelligence estimated 800 soldiers aboard. The human ships looked primitive compared to the sleek coalition vessels already in the system. Their hulls were angular and utilitarian, built for function rather than beauty. Most of the cadets assumed they were seeing supply ships, or perhaps civilian transports that had wandered into a war zone. Coalition Command initially planned to ignore the human force, Veltoth explained. 50,000 troops had failed to take the station. What could 800 possibly accomplish? The answer came faster than anyone expected. Within hours of arriving in the system, the human fleet had taken up positions that seemed to make no tactical sense. Instead of joining the siege lines around the station, they scattered throughout the outer system. The human commander was Captain Do Hyun of the 42nd Marine Battalion, Veltoth said, bringing up a service record hologram. Age 28. No previous combat experience against non-human forces. His tactical officer was Lieutenant Jae Ho, a sniper specialist. His demolitions expert was Sergeant Bo-Ra, barely 22 years old. Taemin's silver scales shifted as he studied the human faces in the display. They looked so young, so ordinary. Nothing about them suggested the kind of military genius that could succeed where 50,000 coalition troops had failed. Captain Do Hyun's first action was to request a meeting with Coalition Command, Veltoth continued. He proposed a joint operation to take the station within 72 hours. Scattered laughter rippled through the amphitheater. Even the most serious cadets found the idea absurd. 72 hours to accomplish what had been impossible in 6 months. The coalition commanders refused, of course, Veltoth said. They told Captain Do Hyun to stay out of the way while real soldiers handled the siege. The holographic display shifted to show the human ships moving into new positions. Instead of approaching the station directly, they began intercepting supply, convoys traveling through the outer system. This was when we first noticed something unusual about human tactics, Veltoth explained as the cadets watched footage of a human boarding action against a coalition supply ship. They did not destroy the vessels they captured. Instead, they took prisoners and sent them back to the station. The returned prisoners brought with them stories that seemed impossible to believe. The humans had treated them well, providing medical care and good food. But they had also done something that violated every rule of civilized warfare. The humans had planted evidence of their presence throughout the captured ships, Veltoth said, his voice dropping lower. Hidden cameras, listening devices, even physical traces like clothing and personal items. They wanted the prisoners to know they had been there. Nari's multiple eyes blinked in confusion. But what was the tactical purpose? Why waste time and resources on psychological games? Veltoth's crystalline features reflected the light from the holographic display as he turned toward her. That question shows you still think like a civilized being. The humans were not playing games. They were hunting. The footage continued, showing more supply ships being intercepted and their crews returned to the station. Each time, the human soldiers left more evidence of their presence: personal photographs, handwritten notes in languages the aliens could not read, small mechanical devices that served no apparent purpose except to prove that humans had been there. Within a week, the defenders of Station Omega-7 were seeing human infiltrators everywhere, Veltoth explained. Shadows in corridors that might be enemies, noises in the ventilation systems that could be saboteurs, equipment failures that seemed too convenient to be accidents. The psychological pressure was unlike anything in recorded military history. Traditional siege warfare involved cutting off supplies and waiting for the enemy to surrender. The humans had turned the siege into a hunting expedition, and the prey was trapped inside an asteroid with nowhere to run. Lieutenant J-Ho began the next phase of the operation, Veltoth said, as new footage appeared in the hologram. Using a modified sniper rifle, he began eliminating sentries on the station's outer defenses. The shots came from impossible distances, far beyond the range of any known weapon. Defenders who ventured outside the station's shields to repair equipment or maintain sensors simply disappeared. Sometimes their bodies were found, sometimes they were not. The station's commander increased patrols and added more guards, Veltoth continued. Lieutenant J-Ho responded by targeting the guards themselves. The footage showed brief flashes of light from the darkness of space, followed by the collapse of alien figures on the station's outer hull. Each shot was impossibly precise, finding the one small gap in armor or the single weak point in an environmental suit. "How is such accuracy possible?" Taman asked, his silver scales rippling with nervous energy. "Even our best marksmen cannot shoot accurately at those ranges." Veltoth's four arms spread in a gesture that encompassed the entire display. "We asked ourselves the same question. Intelligence reports indicated that Lieutenant J-Ho was using a chemical propellant weapon, barely more advanced than ancient firearms. Yet his accuracy exceeded anything our energy weapons could achieve. The answer, when it came, was more disturbing than the cadets could have imagined. Human sniper training did not rely on advanced technology or enhanced sensory capabilities. Instead, it involved mathematical calculations that accounted for gravity, atmospheric conditions, target movement, and dozens of other variables that most species never considered. Humans compensate for their physical limitations through mental discipline, Veltoth explained. They turn warfare into a mathematical equation and solve it with precision that our computers cannot match. But the sniping was only the beginning. While Lieutenant J-Ho eliminated sentries, Sergeant Bo-Ra began the most terrifying phase of the human assault. Sergeant Bo-Ra had studied the station's construction records, Veltoth said, as technical schematics appeared in the holographic display. She identified 17 critical systems that, if damaged simultaneously, would disable the station's shields without destroying the facility itself. The problem was that these systems were located deep inside the asteroid, protected by kilometers of rock and multiple layers of security. Reaching them would require an assault force to fight through the station's entire garrison. Sergeant Bo-Ra did not attempt to fight her way inside, Veltoth continued. Instead, she used the station's own supply systems against it. The humans had studied more than just the station's defensive capabilities. They had analyzed every cargo shipment, every supply delivery, every piece of equipment that entered the facility. They knew exactly how the station's recycling systems worked, how waste was processed, and how air and water moved through the complex. Using chemical compounds readily available in any industrial facility, Sergeant Bo-Ra created 17 separate explosive devices, Veltoth explained as chemical formulas appeared in the display. Each one was small enough to hide inside routine supply shipments. The explosives were not designed to kill. Instead, they were carefully calibrated to damage specific systems at precisely the right moment. When they detonated simultaneously, the station's shields flickered and died. The defenders found themselves trapped inside an asteroid with no protection from outside attack, Veltoth said. But Captain Do-hyun did not order an assault. Instead, he broadcast a message to the station. The recording played for the cadets to hear. Captain Do-hyun's voice was calm and professional as he spoke in perfectly clear galactic standard. "Admiral Thexvol, this is Captain Do-hyun. Your shields are down, and your defensive systems are disabled. You have two choices. Surrender. Now, and your garrison will be treated according to the conventions of war. The silence in the great hall stretched for several long moments before Commander Veltoth continued his lecture. His crystalline features caught the light from the holographic displays as he prepared to share the next chapter of his experiences with human warfare. The cadets sat motionless in their seats, no longer laughing at the mention of humanity as a military threat. The fall of Station Omega-7 marked the beginning of the Coalition's real problems, Veltoth said, his four arms moving to activate new displays showing star charts of human territory. Command decided that if humans could take our strongest fortress, we would take one of their worlds in return. The target was New Sol, a human colony world with a population of 8 million. Intelligence reports indicated minimal military presence, perhaps 5,000 local defense forces armed with primitive weapons. The world produced agricultural products and rare minerals, but had no strategic military value beyond making a statement. Coalition Command assembled an occupation force of 100,000 troops, Veltoth explained, as the display showed the massive fleet gathering at staging areas. The operation was designated as a police action to restore order and protect human civilians from their own government. Cadet Nari's multiple eyes studied the tactical information with growing concern. Even she could see that 100,000 troops was massive overkill for occupying a lightly defended agricultural world. The initial assault went exactly as planned. Veltoth continued. Human orbital defenses were eliminated within 6 hours. Ground forces landed at 12 strategic locations and secured all major cities within 2 days. Total human military casualties were estimated at 3,000 killed or captured. The holographic display showed coalition forces moving through human cities with minimal resistance. Local defense forces had fought bravely, but were completely outmatched by superior numbers and technology. Most human military units had been destroyed or scattered in the opening battles. The occupation should have ended the war, Veltoth said, his mandibles clicking with what might have been regret. Instead, it began a nightmare that lasted 3 years. The first sign of trouble came within a week of the initial landing. Coalition supply convoys traveling between secured cities began disappearing, not destroyed in obvious attacks, but simply vanishing as if they had never existed. Major Sung Ho was the human officer in charge of what remained of New Sol's defense forces, Veltoth explained as a new hologram appeared, showing a human in his 40s with graying hair and tired eyes. Intelligence reports indicated he had perhaps 200 soldiers under his command, scattered throughout the countryside. The coalition commanders initially dismissed Major Sung Ho as a minor nuisance. 200 poorly equipped soldiers could hardly threaten an occupation force of 100,000. They assumed the missing supply convoys were due to navigational errors or equipment failures. We were wrong, Veltoth said simply. The truth became clear when a coalition patrol discovered the wreckage of a supply convoy in a forest outside the capital city. The vehicles had been destroyed with surgical precision, but the attack site told a story that no military academy taught. The humans had not simply ambushed the convoy, Veltoth explained, as detailed forensic images appeared in the holographic display. They had turned the convoy's own cargo against it. The explosives used to destroy the vehicles had been improvised from fertilizer carried in the convoy itself. The attack had been triggered by a simple timer device hidden inside a routine supply crate. Most disturbing of all, the human attackers had apparently been inside the convoy when it exploded. Private Minji was identified as the probable bomber, Veltoth continued, showing the service record of a human female who appeared to be barely 20 years old. Chemical analysis indicated she had ridden with the convoy for several hours, before triggering the explosion that killed her and 30 coalition soldiers. The concept was alien to every species in the galaxy. Soldiers might die heroically in battle or sacrifice themselves to save their comrades, but deliberately destroying oneself as a weapon was unthinkable. The coalition response was swift and severe, Veltoth said, as new images showed orbital bombardment strikes against suspected human positions. Every forest, every mountain, every possible hiding place was targeted for destruction. The bombardment continued for weeks, turning vast areas of New Sol's surface into cratered wasteland. Surely no military force could survive such overwhelming firepower. The coalition commanders congratulated themselves on solving the guerrilla problem. The attacks increased, Veltoth said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been fear. Instead of being destroyed by the bombardment, the human resistance seemed to grow stronger. Supply convoys continued to disappear. Isolated outposts were attacked and overrun. Most disturbing of all, the humans began targeting coalition forces inside their own fortified bases. Captain Hyun-woo was identified as Major Sung-ho's intelligence officer, Veltoth explained, bringing up another human service record. His specialty was what human military doctrine calls psychological operations. The cadets watched in stunned silence as Veltoth described Captain Hyun-woo's campaign against coalition morale. Human agents somehow infiltrated supposedly secure bases and left propaganda materials in soldiers' quarters. Coalition personnel began receiving personal messages from humans who knew details about their families and home worlds. How could humans possibly gather such detailed intelligence? Taemin asked, his silver scales rippling with nervous energy. Our communications were encrypted and our bases were isolated from the local population. Veltoth's 4 eyes fixed on the young Zephyrian. That question kept coalition intelligence busy for months. The answer, when it came, was more disturbing than anyone expected. The humans were not using advanced technology to break coalition codes or infiltrate secure facilities. Instead, they were using something far more dangerous. They were convincing coalition soldiers to betray their own forces. Captain Hyun-woo's technique was simple but effective, Veltoth explained. He identified coalition personnel who were homesick, lonely, or disillusioned with the war. Then he provided them with what they needed most: understanding and companionship. The holographic display showed recorded conversations between human agents and coalition soldiers. The humans never asked for military information directly. Instead, they simply listened as stressed soldiers complained about their situation and talked about their desire to go home. Within 6 months, Captain Hyun-woo had developed a network of coalition personnel who provided information without even realizing they were doing so. Veltoth continued. A casual conversation about supply schedules, a complaint about patrol routes, a mention of which officers were planning to visit which bases. The psychological manipulation was so subtle that most coalition soldiers never realized they were being used. They thought they were simply talking to sympathetic humans who understood their problems. The real horror began when Major Sung-ho started targeting our infrastructure, Veltoth said as new images appeared showing destroyed power plants and communications facilities. The attacks were not random acts of sabotage. Instead, they were carefully coordinated strikes designed to turn the humans' own cities into weapons against the occupying forces. Private Minji had trained other soldiers in her techniques, Veltoth explained. They knew exactly which systems to target to cause maximum disruption with minimal explosives. The humans turned shopping centers into death traps by weakening structural supports and waiting for coalition patrols to enter. They contaminated water supplies not with poison, but with chemicals that caused equipment failures in coalition environmental suits. They even used the planet's own weather systems as weapons, triggering landslides and floods in areas where coalition forces were concentrated. Most terrifying of all, Veltoth continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, the humans began using their own civilian population as shields and weapons. The coalition forces found themselves in an impossible situation. Military doctrine required them to distinguish between combatants and civilians, but the humans had made that distinction meaningless. Children carried messages between resistance cells. Elderly civilians provided safe houses for human soldiers. Medical facilities doubled as weapons factories. How do you fight an enemy that turns every school into a fortress and every hospital into an armory? Veltoth asked, his crystalline features reflecting the confusion and frustration that had plagued coalition commanders. The answer was that you could not, at least not without violating every principle of civilized warfare. The coalition found itself trapped between military necessity and moral obligation, unable to eliminate the resistance without committing genocide against the entire human population. The breaking point came during the 3rd year of occupation. Veltoth said, as the holographic display showed detailed maps of New Seoul's capital city. Major Sung-ho launched what he called the final campaign. Instead of targeting coalition military forces directly, the humans began attacking the infrastructure that coalition troops needed to survive in the human atmosphere: air recycling plants, water purification facilities, Commander Veltoth's voice grew quieter as he prepared to recount the darkest chapter of the border wars. The cadets in the great amphitheater leaned forward in their seats, no longer able to dismiss human military capabilities as primitive or ineffective. What they had heard about guerrilla warfare on New Sol was disturbing enough, but Veltoth's expression suggested that something far worse was coming. After 3 years of failed occupation attempts, Coalition Command made a strategic decision. Veltoth began, his crystalline features reflecting the ambient light of the hall. If human worlds could not be occupied, then human space forces would be eliminated completely. The holographic display activated to show star charts of the Void Nebula, a region of space where sensor interference made navigation extremely difficult and communication nearly impossible. Dense clouds of ionized gas and electromagnetic storms created a maze of hazards that most species avoided entirely. Intelligence reports indicated that the main human fleet had retreated into the Void Nebula after losing several major engagements. Veltoth continued. Admiral Zexthul assembled a force of 800 ships to pursue and destroy them. The Coalition fleet was the largest military force ever assembled for a single operation. Massive dreadnoughts equipped with planet-killing weapons supported by hundreds of smaller vessels and supply ships. The plan was simple: enter the nebula, locate the human fleet, and eliminate it completely. The human force consisted of approximately 200 ships, Veltoth explained as comparative images appeared in the holographic display. Most were damaged from previous battles and operating with skeleton crews. Cadet Tae-min studied the tactical display with growing confusion. Even accounting for the navigation difficulties in the nebula, 800 ships against 200 should have been a massacre in the Coalition's favor. Admiral Wu Jin commanded the human fleet, Veltoth said, bringing up a service record that showed a human male in his 50s with prematurely white hair and eyes that seemed to hold depths of exhaustion. His flagship was the destroyer Sol's Pride, a vessel that had been written off as combat ineffective after sustaining heavy damage in the Battle of Kepler Station. The human admiral's record showed 17 years of service, mostly in minor border conflicts before the Coalition War began. Nothing in his background suggested the kind of tactical genius that could overcome such overwhelming odds. Admiral Zexthul's strategy was methodical and logical, Veltoth continued. Deploy the fleet in a search pattern that would systematically sweep every section of the nebula until the human forces were located and destroyed. The Coalition fleet entered the Void Nebula in perfect formation, maintaining communication through quantum link relays that could penetrate the electromagnetic interference. Each ship knew exactly where its neighbors were positioned and what sector it was responsible for searching. The first sign of trouble came 6 hours after entering the nebula, Veltoth said, as recorded transmissions began playing through the hall's audio systems. Coalition ship commanders reported strange sensor readings that appeared and disappeared without explanation. Brief contact signatures that might be ships or might be natural phenomena caused by the nebula's unstable conditions. Admiral Zexthul ordered the fleet to maintain formation and continue the search, Veltoth explained. False contacts were expected in such an environment, but the contacts were not false. Engineer So Young, the human fleet's chief technical officer, had spent months studying the nebula's properties and developing techniques for hiding ships among the natural interference patterns. The humans had modified their vessels to operate as ghosts, Veltoth said as technical diagrams appeared in the holographic display. Engine emissions were masked by electromagnetic storms. Hull signatures were disguised to match natural debris patterns. The modifications were crude by Coalition standards, involving physical changes to ship hulls and engine configurations that reduced performance and safety margins. Most alien engineers would have considered such alterations to be primitive jury rigging. Engineer So Young had turned the human fleet into predators perfectly adapted to hunt in the nebula environment, Veltoth continued. While Coalition forces searched with active sensors that revealed their positions, human ships moved silently through the electromagnetic chaos. The first Coalition vessel to disappear was the cruiser Righteous Fury, assigned to patrol the outer edge of the search zone. The ship simply vanished from communication networks without sending a distress signal or any indication of what had happened. Admiral Zexthul assumed the vessel had suffered a navigation error or equipment failure. Veltoth explained. Such losses were not uncommon in nebula environments. The second ship disappeared 4 hours later, then a third. By the end of the first day, 7 coalition vessels had simply ceased to exist without explanation. The human attacks were unlike anything in recorded military history, Veltoth said, as grainy sensor footage began playing in the holographic display. They did not attempt to destroy coalition ships completely. Instead, the humans targeted specific systems with surgical precision. Engine cores were damaged just enough to leave ships helpless, but not destroyed. Communication arrays were eliminated to prevent distress calls. Life support systems were sabotaged to force crews to abandon ship. Pilot Daeho led the human fighter squadrons, Veltoth continued, showing the service record of a human male who appeared to be barely 30 years old. His specialty was what human doctrine calls impossible maneuvers. The cadets watched in stunned silence as sensor recordings showed human fighters performing navigation through the nebula that should have resulted in immediate collision with debris or energy discharges. The small craft moved through electromagnetic storms and gravitational anomalies as if such hazards did not exist. "How is such piloting possible?" asked Cadet Nari, her 6 eyes studying the flight patterns that seemed to violate basic physics. Veltoth's 4 arms spread in a gesture that encompassed the entire display. Pilot Daeho and his squadron had spent months mapping the nebula by hand, learning to read the patterns of energy discharge and debris movement. They turned the nebula's hazards into navigational aids. The human pilots were not using advanced technology to avoid the nebula's dangers. Instead, they had developed an intuitive understanding of the environment that allowed them to predict where safe passage could be found from moment to moment. Meanwhile, Admiral Wu Jin implemented the most terrifying aspect of human fleet tactics, Veltoth said, as new tactical displays appeared showing ship movements throughout the nebula. The human admiral had divided his already outnumbered fleet into dozens of small groups, each containing only 3 or 4 vessels. Traditional military doctrine taught that dividing forces in the face of superior numbers was suicide. Admiral Wu Jin was not trying to fight a conventional battle, Veltoth explained. He was turning the nebula itself into a weapon. The human fleet groups moved through the ionized gas clouds like antibodies through a bloodstream, appearing wherever coalition forces were most vulnerable and disappearing before reinforcements could arrive. Engineer So Young had discovered that the nebula's gravitational fields could be manipulated, Veltoth continued as scientific diagrams filled the holographic display. The technique involved using ship engines to trigger cascading reactions in the dense gas clouds, creating artificial gravity wells that could tear apart vessels caught in their influence. The process required precise timing and positioning that most species would consider impossible. "The humans began hunting our dreadnoughts," Veltoth said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Coalition command ships, supposedly protected by massive escorts and heavy armor, began falling victim to gravitational anomalies that appeared without warning. Entire squadrons would be caught in artificial gravity wells that crushed their hulls like empty cans. Admiral Zexthol ordered the fleet to withdraw to defensive positions, Veltoth continued. The search and destroy mission had become a fight for survival. But withdrawal was impossible. The human forces had positioned themselves throughout the nebula in such a way that any attempt to leave resulted in ambush after ambush. Coalition ships found themselves trapped in a maze where every path led to another encounter with invisible enemies. The battle continued for 18 hours, Veltoth said, as casualty reports appeared in the holographic display. Coalition forces lost 60% of their fleet strength. The numbers were staggering. Over 400 ships destroyed or disabled, with casualties numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The largest military force in coalition history had been shattered by an enemy they could barely detect. Human losses were 40%, Veltoth continued. Approximately 80 ships destroyed. But the human casualties told a different story. Every damaged human vessel had been jury-rigged back into fighting condition, using parts salvaged from destroyed coalition ships. Engineer So Young's teams had apparently prepared for such losses by designing their repairs in advance. The humans fought as if they had expected to lose nearly half their fleet, Veltoth explained. They had planned for catastrophic damage and continued fighting anyway. The great amphitheater of the Galactic Military Academy had never been so quiet. Commander Veltoth stood at the center of the vast hall, his crystalline features reflecting the ambient light as hundreds of cadets waited to hear the conclusion of his tale. The young officers who had laughed at the mention of human military capabilities now sat in stunned silence, trying to comprehend how a species they considered primitive had brought the mighty coalition to its knees. 3 months after the battle, of the Void Nebula, Coalition High Command transmitted a formal request for peace negotiations. Veltoth began, his 4 arms moving to activate the final holographic display of his lecture. The location chosen was Harmony Station, a neutral facility in unclaimed space. The massive space station appeared in the air above the cadets, its gleaming surfaces and multiple docking bays designed to accommodate delegations from dozens of different species. Harmony Station had hosted peace talks for countless conflicts over the centuries, but never under circumstances quite like these. The coalition delegation consisted of 47 members, Veltoth continued, as images of various alien dignitaries appeared in the display. Military commanders, political leaders, economic advisors, and cultural specialists. Every major species in the coalition sent their finest negotiators. The human delegation was notably smaller. Only 12 individuals, led by Ambassador Yun-Su, a human female who appeared to be in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. Her credentials showed extensive experience in trade negotiations but no background in military affairs. Coalition Command expected the negotiations to last several months, Veltoth explained. Standard procedure for ending a conflict of this magnitude required detailed discussion of territorial boundaries, reparations, prisoner exchanges, and dozens of other complex issues. The talks began with traditional diplomatic protocols. Both sides presented their initial positions and outlined their objectives for the peace process. The coalition demanded guarantees that human expansion would be limited to designated sectors. They wanted access to human technology and resources to compensate for war losses. Ambassador Un-Su listened politely to all coalition demands, Veltoth said, as recorded footage showed the human diplomat sitting calmly at the negotiating table. Then she presented the human position. The human demands were simple and non-negotiable. Complete withdrawal of coalition forces from all human-claimed territory, recognition of human sovereignty over all systems they currently occupied. Most shocking of all, the humans wanted nothing from the coalition in return. No reparations, Veltoth explained, his mandibles clicking with remembered confusion. No territorial concessions, no technology transfers. The humans simply wanted to be left alone. The coalition negotiators had prepared for months to discuss complex trade-offs and political compromises. They were completely unprepared for an enemy that asked for nothing except to be ignored. General Quan Ho served as the human military advisor. Veltoth continued, bringing up the service record of a human male who appeared to be in his 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much war. His presence at the negotiations was intended to provide technical expertise on military matters. Coalition commanders had expected to spend considerable time discussing rules of engagement, weapons limitations, and monitoring procedures to prevent future conflicts. General Quan Ho's response to such questions was consistently brief and disturbing. When asked about human compliance with galactic weapons conventions, General Quan Ho stated that humans would continue to follow their own military doctrine, Veltoth said as the recorded conversation played for the cadets to hear. The human general's voice was calm and professional as he explained that human military thinking did not recognize the concept of weapons too powerful to use. If something could be built, it would be built. If it could be deployed, it would be deployed. Coalition negotiators pressed for specific limitations on human military development. Veltoth continued. General Quan Ho's response ended that line of discussion permanently. The recording showed the human general leaning back in his chair and speaking with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather rather than instruments of mass destruction. "Gentlemen, ladies, honored beings," General Quan Ho said, his words carrying across the negotiating table with quiet authority. "You have witnessed perhaps 10% of human military capability. Everything you have seen was conducted under rules of engagement designed to minimize casualties and preserve infrastructure." The coalition delegation sat in stunned silence as the implications of his words became clear. We have techniques and weapons that are considered too inhumane for use against sapient species, General Quan Ho continued. Military doctrine that is classified above my clearance level. Technologies that our own military refuses to deploy except in cases of species survival. Ambassador Yun Su nodded thoughtfully at her military advisor's comments before addressing the coalition delegation with a smile that did not reach her eyes. I think what General Quan Ho is trying to explain is that the war you have experienced represents humanity operating under significant ethical constraints, she said, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been sympathy. We have been very careful to limit ourselves to tactics that would not result in permanent psychological trauma for your personnel. The casual mention of psychological trauma as a limiting factor rather than an objective sent chills through the coalition negotiating team. What kind of military doctrine considered mind-breaking enemy soldiers to be an act of restraint? Colonel In-ho provided the most disturbing insight into human military thinking, Veltoth said, as another human officer appeared in the holographic display. Colonel In-ho was younger than the other human delegates, perhaps 40 years old, with the lean build and alert posture of someone who had spent years in combat operations. His service record showed extensive experience in what human documentation euphemistically called special operations. When asked about human strategic objectives, Colonel In-ho's response clarified the true scope of what the coalition had been facing. Veltoth continued as the recorded conversation resumed. Coalition negotiators had assumed that human military actions during the war represented their maximum effort to achieve victory. Colonel In-ho's explanation revealed how wrong they had been. Honored delegates, I believe there has been a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of this conflict, Colonel In-ho said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly how dangerous he was. You have been conducting a war. We have been conducting a training exercise. The words fell into the negotiating chamber like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through the entire coalition delegation. Human military doctrine recognizes only two types of conflict, Colonel In-ho continued. Training operations designed to test our capabilities against worthy opponents and extermination campaigns designed to eliminate threats to species survival. The colonel paused to let his words sink in before delivering the statement that would haunt coalition military planners for years to come. If you ever force us to transition from the first category to the second, you will understand why we are the only species in galactic history to achieve complete planetary sterilization using nothing but conventional weapons. Ambassador Yunsu quickly moved to clarify that Colonel In-ho was speaking hypothetically, but the damage was done. The coalition delegation now understood that everything they had experienced during 3 years of war had been humanity holding back. The negotiations concluded within 72 hours, Veltoth said, as the holographic display showed documents being signed by representatives of both sides. The coalition agreed to every human demand without modification. The peace treaty was the shortest document of its kind in galactic history. Complete withdrawal of coalition forces from human territory within 6 months. Recognition of human sovereignty over all claimed systems. Most importantly, a mutual non-interference agreement that essentially guaranteed the two powers would have minimal contact for the foreseeable future. The human delegation departed Harmony Station immediately after the signing ceremony. Veltoth continued. Ambassador Unsu's final statement to the coalition negotiators was both a warning and a promise. The recording showed the human ambassador standing at the departure gate, her expression serious but not hostile as she addressed the coalition delegates one last time. The peace we have achieved today can last indefinitely if both sides honor their commitments, Ambassador Yunsu said, her words carefully chosen and precisely delivered. Humanity has no desire for conquest or expansion beyond our current territory. We simply want to develop our civilization without outside interference. She paused, her intelligent eyes studying the faces of the alien delegates before delivering her final warning. However, I want to ensure there are no misunderstandings about the consequences of breaking this peace, Ambassador Yunsu continued. If any coalition member attacks human territory or threatens human civilians, you will discover why my people have never lost a war.